started with a cough. Am I able to see anybody else here? Can we see if there's, I
Are you
can't
able
see
to
my
see anybody?
audience.
Yeah, the audience can see you, but you can't see them.
Okay, well then I will not take any more time. I'm going to get started. Thank you, Olumide. Hi, everyone. And I'll just start a timer to keep myself on track. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Jolly at UGA 2022 Virtual Winter Conference. And the theme for this year is Language and Literacy through Intercultural Citizenship Education. And the conference is geared towards teachers, researchers, policymakers, leaders, and learners. And the agenda was to create pathways to dismantle systemic racism and injustice while embracing openness, respect, empathy, and empowerment. And we dreamed of transformative explorations of diversity, justice, race, ethnicity, and ethics. And of course, when I say we, this is the collective Jolly we, but also Olumide's vision, of course, that has shaped our conference. Before I say anything further, I wanted to position myself culturally, linguistically, and therefore intellectually. I think particularly in discussions of culture and languages, the positioning of oneself is really critical, so we can situate where our knowledge centers come from. So I've lived, studied, and or worked in India, the US, Holland, Canada, and Indonesia. I visited a variety of other countries, but these are the spaces in which I stayed for a while. And I was born and raised in India, but have spent nearly half my life in the US at this point. And the languages that I grew up with included Bangla, Hindi, Urdu, and English and Sanskrit from a devotional perspective. And I also studied French and German as a foreign language. And when I lived in Indonesia, I was immersed in Bahasa Indonesia, but picked up little. And in terms of my identities, being Bengali, Hindu, multilingual, brown, a woman, Indian, a US citizen, mother scholar, a mother of a child with Rett syndrome, and therefore Rett mom, as we are known in the community sometimes, and a mother to a mixed race child also form aspects of my identity that are salient, but of course there's so much else also that frames who I am. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes just talking about framing the ideas, some of the central ideas of intercultural citizenship, and I'll begin with one definition that I found that's useful. So intercultural citizenship occurs when people who perceive themselves as having different cultural affiliations from one another interact and communicate, and then analyze and reflect on this experience and act on that reflection by engaging in civic or political activity. And this is, the citations are there. This is from Byram, Golubova, Hui, and Wagner. And we're very lucky to have keynote speakers who are part of the scholarship and instrumental in the scholarship. And so I found it helpful to see from Porto in 2019 the three dimensions laid out. So the relational dimension, so getting involved with others, the critical dimension, which is of course very crucial as well, the civic or citizenship dimension, and I wanted to move from that in towards some of the key terms that I found as I myself engaged with the scholarship in new ways, because this is not my primary area, but Claire Kramsch, who was on my dissertation committee, of course, has engaged with this, and I've learned about this field through her and others over time. The ideas of criticality, native speakerism, intercultural speaker, nation-state loyalty, internationalism, and action in the community, all these things are very vital and part of the discourse around intercultural citizenship. So I started thinking from my own perspective and my scholarly and training, what are the kinds of questions that are critical given the work that I do in language ideology and language and literacy socialization. So some of the questions that immediately came to me are, what are historical understandings of native, of other, civic, political, nation, community, and action that circulate in this field, and how are they tied to relations of power and dominance? How do language and literacy and epistemological ideologies actually shape ICE, and where has this work been done, by whom, with what scholarly motivation? So this has been actually done in a wide variety of contexts, but where is a question that has to be critically engaged with. And again, who are the people doing this work? And these are questions we should ask in any field, in any area of scholarship. And of course, the relationship to the people with whom we're doing these kinds of research, for example. And what kind of critical scholarship is this work in dialogue with? So I'm thinking of CDA, critical race theory, critical disability studies, the last of which is particularly crucial in the work I do, for example. And I was looking at, in preparation for this address, the welcome address, I was looking at a really groundbreaking piece by Bayram, reflecting on 25 years on from cultural studies to intercultural citizenship. And Bayram says there that the idea of looking at the responsibility of language teachers for introducing learners to another culture and involving them in decisions which are educational and political, this idea comes from his reading of the German theory of Landeskunde and collaboration with others. And I was beginning to think that that's why our transparency in terms of where these epistemological centers come from and how we apply them in centers that are not, but perhaps coming from the same cultures of epistemology. What is at stake there in having theories that come from specific spaces, and what is the awareness around what those epistemological centers mean? I then just started thinking about ideas around citizenship, culture, language, and literacy regarding this particular conference, and of course, ideas of citizenship. Where does the idea of the citizen that we use within the scholarship come from? And from what centers of power, for example, and what kinds of political and epistemological areas of inquiry? And how does the concept vary across different cultural spaces, and how is that accounted for in the scholarship? And from how do we recognize discitizenship as well, which Ramanathan has written about. She frames it as exclusions experienced by marginalized groups, and there's work in critical disability studies that addresses that. The idea of culture. So what is culture, and what is the comparative scope of culture? And, what does it mean about who is making those kinds of cultural comparisons? And there I was interested in thinking about issues of directionality, and how do we take into account the power differential inherent in and across cultural encounters? As somebody who has lived in a variety of different spaces and whose work engages with people from different cultural spaces, that's something that I constantly have to tussle with. And then, of course, an idea of language and literacy. How does our understanding accommodate the culturally varying constructions of language and literacy? And not only do I think about this from a perspective of culture, but I also think about this from a perspective of ableism, for example. When my daughter has significant disabilities that medically render her unable to speak by mouth and use her hands in a functional manner. And what is language? What is literacy? And what kinds are we mindful of our ableism when we construct ideas of language and literacy as well? In the course of looking for this, and I was trying to create, write up the keynote and make the slides, I landed on this paper and I was reading it, and it's a really powerful piece, and yet I found this typo, and it pointed towards this kind of unintentional, that it unintentionally pointed to something that I find we always have to be mindful of in any kind of discussions of language, cultural and cross-cultural encounters, because of the history of foreign language education, of course, especially from the centers from which we are speaking, is saviorism. And so this is a screenshot from the paper, and again, a paper I really enjoyed reading and I thought which had really powerful ideas. The word savoir gets turned into savior, and I think those are the exact spaces of unintentional, unintentional pointing that we also need to be mindful of within the literature. And of course, in this entire dialogue is taking place in the backdrop of war right now. And so as we talk about ideas of collaboration, international community, cross-cultural dialogue, and critical understanding, and use terms like foreign and world and global as if we are indexing very specific ideas of us and them, we also have to be thinking about what it means that it takes place under discriminatory practices, and when it takes place in time of conflict, where these are not straightforward, and there's a history of, histories of oppression and histories of assault, and that frame our understanding of these terms. So what is the meaning of these as they take place in current political circumstances, for example? And that's something that I hope we will keep in mind as the day progresses. And I, as is my wont, when I'm confronted with educational ideas and challenges, I go back to wisdom from my homeland. And I found this quote from Mahatma Gandhi to be thoughtful and to inspire, inspiring, especially when it comes to the data I've collected over 12 or 13 years in India at a suburban Indian orphanage and a village school, looking at the language and literacy practices of young boys at an orphanage. This idea that education should be so revolutionized as to answer the wants of the poorest villager instead of answering those of an imperial exploiter. And so much of the language, the education and training and discourse around English teaching in India happens under the umbrella of within understandings that really further interests of the imperial exploiter. If you think of the role of English within the Indian context as gatekeeping fundamentally, and how could we turn that around? That should be our call as folks in education. We're going to be talking about intercultural citizenship, of course, as the larger umbrella, but neoliberalism, translanguaging, social justice, disability, inclusion, multilingualism, teacher education, lexicography, emotion, literature, pedagogy, rhetoric, race, schooling, trauma-informed teaching, augmentative and alternative communication, among others, over the course of today and tomorrow. And so we are very excited and so wonderfully thrilled to have our wonderful keynote speakers, and we'll be starting with that in just a couple of minutes. And I want to thank Olumide, who's our conference chair and whose vision really, as I mentioned, trying to keep myself on time, whose vision this has been, trying to keep this, okay. And our wonderful editorial board, Yishuan, Jennifer, Madison, Wei, Tuba, Xing, Saurabh, Vishnu, Helena, and we are all from very different spaces, including the US, China, India, Taiwan, Indonesia, and Turkey. And over the past year, the vision of the conference as it has evolved has engaged with these very different perspectives. So I want to end with Sri Ramakrishna's comment that as long as I live, so long do I learn. I'm excited to learn with you all, and thank you very much for attending this conference. Olumide, I can't hear you.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bachataria, for that wonderful presentation and introduction. We appreciate all that you have done so far for us. Thank you for being a wonderful advisor. So thank you for your presentation. So without much ado, I will go right now to introduce the keynote speaker, and Dr. Wagner is in the backstage, and she's going to be joining me right here. Okay. All right. So, uh, so again, good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to see your beautiful faces this morning, and I want to welcome you to the Journal of Language and Literacy Education's Winter 2022 conference. My name is Olumide Ajayi. I'm a second year PhD student in the Department of Language and Literacy Education, and I'm the conference chair for this year's Jolly Conference. On behalf of the Jolly Editorial Board, the University of Georgia, and the Department of Language and Literacy Education of the College of Education, it is my honor to welcome you to this beautiful conference. Thank you for being part of what promises to be a day of engaging and illuminating presentations and conversations across increasingly diverse topics. In reaction to the socio-political challenges of 2021, the Jolly 2021 conference was a forward-thinking response to the fear and tension that we had at that time. Of course, everybody knew about the pandemic and the stress that it caused a lot of people around the globe. The theme for this year's conference, Language and Literacy Through Intercultural Citizenship Education, is grounded in the context of a continuing pandemic. It's another attempt to reevaluate and reconstruct the status quo educational practices and research in educational theory and practice. Through intercultural citizenship education, a framework for social action is provided to reconsider current values, beliefs, and stereotypes that ignore pluralism and respect intercultural exchanges within the field of language and literacy education. And that's why we called for proposals connecting research and practice that transformatively explore issues of diversity, justice, race, ethnicity, intercultural citizenship, and professional ethics in language and literacy education. Talking about the keynote speaker, I first noticed Dr. Wagner's work as a master's student here at the University of Georgia. At that time, I was fascinated about how intercultural citizenship could be an emancipatory tool for societal change, considering the melting pot narrative that overtly stares us in the face, especially in this context. She had published extensively with Dr. Michael Byram in this area. And being one of the formidable voices in this area, we are excited to have her at our conference. Dr. Wagner is a professor of language education and a director of the German Language and Cultural Program at the University of Connecticut. Our research examines the integration of intercultural competence and intercultural citizenship in world language education across the curriculum from elementary school through post-secondary education. She is particularly interested in the interplay of theory and practice and has been part of and helped create communities of practice to implement models of intercultural competence and citizenship, as well as related theoretical frameworks in practice. Our work in interdisciplinary implementation of intercultural citizenship projects includes the relationship between human rights education, education for social justice, racial linguistics, and education for intercultural citizenship. She has co-edited volumes on teaching interculturally competence across the age range from Theory to Practice in 2018, and Education for Intercultural Citizenship, Principles in Practice in 2017. She has also co-authored books on teaching intercultural citizenship across curriculum, the role of language education, and this appeared in Actful in 2019. She is currently the chair and general Education Oversight Committee, co-chair Applied Linguistics and Discourse Studies, and co-chair German Studies at the University of Connecticut. With that being said, let's welcome Dr. Wagner for our keynote address. Dr. Wagner, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Olumide Ajay. I'm just stunned, first of all, by you stopped it at exactly at 9:20. This is almost unheard of that this happens. I'd like to thank you, especially, and your committee, your conference committee, and the University of Georgia, UGA, for inviting me to be with you today. It's really exciting. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I wish we could be in person, but this is wonderful as well. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Bhattacharya for her truly insightful introduction that is so helpful to me, because the way I see this issue is actually also with a lot of criticality. You will see that criticality is a very big, important concept that plays into everything I would like to do, and I would like to be more critical. This is truly important. So I'm really grateful for this introduction that sets so many things that I want to say up. I'm also grateful to the Jolly Conference organizers for their thoughtful planning of this conference, putting these topics together that sometimes are seen in isolation, and also for thinking about theory in practice. Both are, of course, truly important, but if not seen together, I think that they are not quite the same. If we put theory in practice, theory changes, and it makes us more humble, and intellectually humble, but also culturally humble. And so I think that's truly important as well. So just to situate myself a little bit, I was born and raised in Austria. I studied with my master's thesis in the United States. My master's thesis was on first language acquisition. I always was interested in how we learn to communicate effectively. I worked with babies, blind babies, and infants who had a genetic syndromes. I was interested in how we learn to communicate in all kinds of circumstances. I then studied at the Max Planck Institute for Brain Research in Germany. And came back with my dissertation to analyze my dissertation, the data for my dissertation that I collected in Germany. My languages are German, my first language. I learned English in school and French in school, Spanish and English at the university. Spanish more so actually during a job I had when I was studying throughout my studies as a waitress in a Peruvian restaurant. Okay, I'm trying to... Here we go. So before we start, I would love to know who is in this room. So if you could write in the chat what your name is, if you feel like that, from where you're joining us, and what languages you teach. While you do that, and I hope I can see the chats coming up. While you do that, I'd also like to say, it's truly impressive to me that this conference is taking place right now. These are very difficult times. These are especially difficult times for graduate students. So kudos again, and also for teachers and administrators. So my heart goes out to all of us, but to all of you here, and I'm grateful that you're joining us. Olumide, I do not see the chat.
Okay, can you see them now?
No, it does not come. It says hide chat, and when I click, it just comes up and says you're sharing the screen with others and don't want private chat messages to be visible. So it does not display for me. So if you could actually help out and say some of the things you see in the chat, that would be great. What languages do we have? From
All
where
right.
joining us? And in the background, you hear my dog Obi-Wan. I cannot avoid that 100%. I apologize.
Okay, for some languages that we have, English and German. Okay, so there are people from the University of Georgia, there are people from the University of South Carolina.
Wonderful. Very nice. Okay.
Okay, and there's somebody from the University of Boulder, Colorado.
Wonderful.
And I see Mandarin, Chinese, Turkish.
Great. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Olumide, if I may ask you, maybe there's a setting that you can change so that I can eventually see the chat, if that's possible. So I just continue from here, but if I may call on you if I don't see the chat, that would be great.
All right, I'll work on that and let you know. All right, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so what we are going to think about really in, again, terms where we put theory into practice. Apart from language, what do you think? And you can think about it and you can write it in the chat if you like. Apart from language, what do you think students should learn in language education? And I don't even want to get into the term of foreign language education, second language education, etc. The term foreign for me really situates language education as us versus them, which I really do not like, and I think can actually be really quite dangerous in a sense, but that's a whole other conversation. But in our language classes, what should our students learn apart from language? I'm going to give you some ideas that I have together with colleagues. All this work I'm doing happens with various colleagues, and I share some research ideas with you, some research projects later on as well, and some implementation projects. But the general thought is really, we live in a world in which right now with the pandemic, for example, we really notice how important it is that we can engage in real intercultural dialogue, understanding each other, collaborating with each other across difference and solving problems. And this is from a UNESCO white paper during the pandemic. But we also know, and this is from colleagues at the University of Connecticut who had a big grant to look into intellectual humility and conviction. So how can we really, again, open up and listen to each other, really listen to each other, learn from each other, know what we know and know what we need to learn, and then have conviction to do something, right? And that's actually quite difficult when we look around. People have a hard time really truly listening to each other, and there are a whole lot of skills involved to do that. Another actually slide that I oops, there's something missing. A slide is missing. So this is actually from a knight, veteran diplomat and knight commander of the Order of the British Empire, Paddy Ashton. He was in many war-ridden zones. And his third law of the modern age, how he called it, it's the late, he unfortunately is not with us anymore, but he said, where everything is connected with everything, to everything, the most important thing about what you can do is what you can do with others. I'll repeat that. Where everything is connected to everything, the most important thing about what you can do is what you can do with others. And for me, this really means collaboration. We need to foster collaboration in our students, action with people from different backgrounds. And going back to the wonderful introduction to the conference, in a way that does not involve white savior syndrome, right? In a way that comes from intellectual humility, comes from cultural humility. That is always important. We cannot forget that. Otherwise, we foster skills and attitudes that we don't want to foster. So they were turned around. So Michael Byram, who was mentioned as well, and who is just a pioneer in this field, who has for so many years has enlightened us with his concepts and with his actions actually in research and in education, really points to the importance of of education to play a role in this endeavor. So given the tendency of individuals to remain within the security of their own group and to protect their own self-esteem, for example, there's a significant role for education in preparing them to resist this tendency and meet the challenges involved, right? So something to keep in mind again, and it would be wonderful. I still don't see a chat, so let's try if I might see the chat now. If you feel like sharing, maybe you can put in the chat a few notes of what intercultural citizenship means to you. It does not need to be an extensive definition, but what comes to mind when you think of intercultural citizenship. And I don't think I see the chat yet. And maybe if I could ask Olumide, if you happen to see answers, there might not might not be answers yet because it takes a while to think of those things. But if you see some answers coming in, it would be wonderful to hear what our colleagues say.
Okay. So I see answers like global citizenship, inclusion, equity for all.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Anything else coming in?
Yeah, there's nothing else for now. Okay,
Okay.
I see a sense of belonging to a global identity, thinking beyond one's nation and into a brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity.
Wonderful. Oh, wonderful. I'd love to take a note of that later on. That's great. Thank you very much, Olumide, and thank you for everyone who answered. And in the meantime, we can keep this question in mind. Thank you. So I'm going to share with you a model of intercultural communicative competence on the left-hand side, and there is something a little cut off. I apologize. And together with the characteristics on the right-hand side, we are talking about intercultural citizenship. And Dr. Bhattacharya actually did a wonderful introduction of the concept already. So I would ask you, if I may. Oh, I see the chat now. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so if I may ask you if you could take note of the concepts in the circle when I talk about them, because in the next slides I will refer to that. So Michael Byrom really, as I said, was a pioneer in this field. Over 25 years ago now, he introduced the model of intercultural communicative competence that you can see on the left-hand side. I have used this model for quite a while now because I find it really useful. I use it in combination with other models. Tomorrow, Dr. Golub-Weber is going to introduce another model that also Michael Byrom was involved in. But in essence, this model says, if we want to make sure that our students can really engage in intercultural dialogue, we need to go beyond the linguistic skills only, right? On the top, you see the linguistic skills that we tend to teach in language classrooms, but we really need to go beyond those skills in order to help our students engage in intercultural dialogue with others. And here, the intercultural competence in the circle, those aspects, those components come into play. So, of course, our students need to have knowledge of the values, behaviors, the 3 Ps. We can also say, if we talk in actful language, the products, perspectives, and practices of another cultural context in our own. And I really also want to shy away from nation culture concepts, right? There's much more complexity than that. And I actually wanted to also emphasize, I'm just going to put this up so that I don't say the name wrong. I shortened this presentation a little bit because we only have an hour and I want to bring in the complexity, but at the same time, I want you to take something practical away from this. So culture, of course, has a lot of different definitions, but I want to make sure when I do this with students, no matter at what age, no matter at what level with the language, that they leave with a more complex notion of culture, that they go beyond the similarities of cultural groups, but really think about how open it is, how diffuse it is, how penetrable culture is, how interwoven and discursively produced it is, and something that was mentioned also in the initial presentation of the conference, dependent on hierarchical power structures, and that's crucially important. And of course, factors such as gender, educational level, generation, religion, and status, and so on play a role. So culture can really be used to include, but it can also be used to exclude and worse. So this is adapted from a definition from Hiller et al. 2010. But when we talk about the intercultural competence, so we talk about knowledge on the one hand, right, in the circle, but then you also need the skills to interpret information from another context and relate it to your own, to do this comparative work, but in a way, again, that's humble, not seeing something, making a judgment immediately. That judgment comes later and it's important, but you don't do that immediately. You really need to constantly engage in that interpreting, relating, trying to wrap your mind around something. For that, you need to be open-minded, curious. You need to have tolerance of ambiguity. And those are the attitudes on the right-hand side in the circle. Our students interact with each other and with colleagues, with speakers of the language, first, second language speakers, third language speakers of the language. It doesn't need to be native speakers. The whole native speaker issue is a whole other question. And I see in your conference, you have some interesting presentations about this. But to interact in the target language, if possible, with others, and learn, discover new information from different perspectives. The different perspectives are crucial as well. And then the important concept that for me actually helps me pull the projects together and get to a point where I say, okay, so here we are somewhere where we are working on this criticality, that critical cultural awareness. Evaluate critically, and Michael Byrom updated that definition in 2021 when he published the second edition of his 1997 book. Evaluate critically and on the basis of an explicit systematic process of reasoning values present in one's own and other cultures. So that's an important aspect, right? To have that criticality. So in other words, we are collecting information, finding out, learning, hopefully enough information so that we don't just see something in a simplified way anymore, still knowing there's much, much more to know. But at some point, we need to make a judgment on the basis of what we learned, and then we can go from there, right? That criticality, that is really important for me. And this model helps me to make sure that I get there with my students. And I'll show you a simple example. It's very simplified. And of course, if something is simple, it's open for a whole lot of criticism, and I invite you to critique this. But it shows how the different components of this model connect in an educational project in a high school. Okay, so are we good here? Then, if we combine these skills, right? If the intercultural communicative competence, if our students can do this, and then they act in the here and now on a societal problem of their choice, and it doesn't need to be international, right? We have interculturality everywhere almost, right? So if they act in the here and now and bring what they learn outside of the classroom walls, hopefully even the school walls, maybe even the borders, but if they do something about a problem that they see, we do not tell them what to think and what to do. That's also really important to me. That's a criticism that I hear sometimes of this kind of work, and I agree with it. I also agree with the white savior criticism. We need to be very careful doing this work. On the other hand, not doing anything, waiting for our students to do this at some point later on is also not an option for me. Okay, so Now, I am going to ask you, I'm going to share an example that actually Michael Byram and Fabiana Cardetti, she is a mathematics professor at the University of Connecticut. She's from Argentina. The three of us together planned a unit with a teacher, high school teacher of German in Massachusetts. She's a wonderful colleague. Each year, the students visit each other. So the students from Germany come visit their school in Massachusetts, and another year, the students from Massachusetts go visit the students in Germany, in Bavaria, in Vilshofen. And what I'm going to ask you, unfortunately, the animations don't work. We only found that out pretty late. But normally I would actually not show you the left-hand side, but I'm going to walk you through the activities and tell you what we were thinking with this activity. And hopefully you can see if it makes sense for you so that you can see the model in action. So before the students came, or when the students came to the US, the German students, or the students from Germany, they're not all German students, or students, yeah. So before they came, we asked, as a homework, the German teacher asked his students, in this case, to read something about sports in America. And we had prepared some materials. They could also look for their own, but they read it in English. The students here in America read about sports in Germany in German, and we had again prepared some of the points. The teacher shared with us that in prior projects, a lot of positive stuff happened. There was wonderful interaction, but the students tended to stay at the point of when they were surprised about something, well, that's just weird, that's just odd. And then they left it at that in many instances. And we wanted to go beyond that. So we asked students to think about the following questions. Does anything strike you as odd or weird? We used their term. Which are the three things that you found most interesting? Which interesting facts are specific to culture in your opinion? And again, we need to get to a notion of really American culture. What is that German culture? And they found that out in the course of the project, that there's a lot of variety and it's much more complex, but that's another story. Can you identify one or two things that you would not find in your own country in that context? So again, when we talk with students, we also need to make sure students understand things. So this is in the language. So this is what we did. And then we said, please prepare a few questions. And the American students prepared it in German for the next class when they meet with their German visitors to discuss this. So here we really went after knowledge discovery. We wanted the students to find out more information. They had to interpret information and relate it to their own. And through the questions we asked, and Obi agrees with us here, they had to show some attitudes of curiosity to some degree, hopefully, right? Tolerance of ambiguity when they found information that didn't quite match what they thought. Hopefully also open-mindedness. Okay. So the next step, and this is simplified, there were many activities, of course, additional activities that they do. But in the next step, we ask students to ask each other those prepared questions, right? And in a way, we push students to not just assume things, but treating others as experts. And again, this was actually a project that we combined with intellectual humility, and I didn't include every aspect here to not make it too confusing. But in this aspect, it's important. If you think you don't know everything and you treat someone else as expert, that actually fosters your intellectual humility. Then when you treat someone as expert and find out they might not know everything about this either, because just because they're from Vilshofen doesn't mean they know everything about every sport in Germany. So those are really interesting thoughts about knowledge production. And who has knowledge, right? Then we asked them to complete a table with their own beliefs. So we really induced stereotypes a little bit at this point because they had read something, but not all that much yet, right? That was still going on. We also put in, this was a sample table, some topics that were actually a little, that went beyond simple facts, right? So, racial discrimination, is there racism in sports, right? And students had quite interesting examples. Students also had interesting examples about In America, you can get a scholarship and study at the university if you're good at sports. That's not the case in Germany, for example. So they really mulled this over and said, oh, this is really odd. And then they talked about it, and then they changed their opinion after a while and thought about this as well. So what we were doing here by students asking each other was, of course, interacting and hopefully discovering, right? And they had to interpret and relate as well. So that's where what we were after here mainly in this part of the activity. So then we asked them, after they had gained more knowledge, they had read more articles, they had spent whole bus rides from Massachusetts to New York to talk about this issue. They all interviewed way more than 5 students, and then collected the data and analyzed it in their math class and represented it and so on. But what we asked them to do is actually, now you need to make a conclusion based on your interviews. What you thought before, right? Was it true? Wahr in German. Falsch, false, wrong. Meine Meinung. What is my opinion now? Right? And again, we had talked about this so much by then, and also about intellectual humility, that we said, that's your opinion right now, but you still don't have all the information. And so, of course, here we are after critical cultural awareness, analyzing and concluding to some degree, right? Using our reasoning to come to a conclusion. Finally, in the next part, the students shared what they learned during the activity with a group of students outside of their own context. In Germany, they can present it in a forum. In America here, they had food and invited others from other contexts, and really shared their findings. They had posters, they had pamphlets. So it went outside of their classroom community. It was a small act, but something that went beyond the classroom walls. And that's, of course, that action piece of intercultural citizenship. Okay, so far so good. If there are any urgent questions, I would take them now. Otherwise, I would go on and contextualize this a little more. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So we have, great. Thank you very much for this. So what I wanted to show here is that students can use their developing language and intercultural communicative competence and apply them in the here and now. From early on with regard to their age, from very early on with regard to their language skills. We can do those activities with all kinds of different skills, language skills, and we should really do them, in my opinion, from early on. I would say from the first class, basically. So if you want to see more examples of how teachers, together with graduate students, actually planned units, then this book might be for you. This is something that I did together with Dori Perugini. She's a Spanish teacher in a local high school. And with Michael Byram, I actually taught a graduate course, and the graduate students, together with teachers, each planned a unit using the theory of intercultural communicative competence in this context, applied it to a unit they did, taught it, and then wrote about it together. And really wrote about it in honest ways, where they said these were some challenges we had, because when we introduce theory in practice, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, there are bumps in the road, and it's humbling. And this is what, once you do it, you cannot stop doing it, I think. Another example is a book that I was engaged with together with our second keynote speaker, Dr. Golubeva, with Helen Hahn, and with Michael Byram. This is a book in which we again shared examples of practitioners and researchers who work together, in this case in international projects. So we have projects with Argentina and Denmark, Argentina and I think in this case England, South Korea and America, and so on. And we used the framework of intercultural citizenship together with Panet's model of criticality. It's a developmental model of criticality that leads in the end to using one's criticality to engage in action in the world. So again, you have the units in there more or less, you have experiences and also challenges that we experienced. So now I want to actually link this, and again, I'm grateful for the initial presentation that opened this conference, to social justice education. Because for me, intercultural citizenship education, social justice education, and other critical approaches are really intimately linked. I actually would even go as far as to say, if I do not link it with a critical approach, I'm missing something crucial. And so social justice education, a short definition by Nieto in 2010 is, it's a philosophy, an approach, and actions that embody treating all people with fairness, respect, dignity, and generosity. And so you can already see, if you follow this when you plan your units, you might be in less danger of inducing a power differential when you do those projects that you're planning. But really thinking about, how can I fight oppression, right? And how can I engage in sustaining my students and the communities, cultures, cultural identities, linguistic identities, diverse identities in every aspect, right? Okay. So in Teaching for Intercultural Citizenship, I'm bringing it back and forth now to share a little bit of my thinking and some of my colleagues' thinking with you. Teaching for Intercultural Citizenship is really helping students understand their roles in the world, engaging in democratic intercultural dialogue, democratic in the sense of really dignity for all, understanding each other, everybody has rights, right? We also need to understand who are the students in our classroom. In language education, sometimes I feel we are in danger of exoticizing language and saying, this language happens over there. No, language happens everywhere. Different languages happen everywhere. And this exoticizing is not a good idea. In fact, it's actually dangerous, and it induces harm, right? So we need to see our students in our classroom sustain their identities, and as well, first and foremost, I would even say. And so also, when we engage in action projects outside of the classroom, there are many ethical questions that come up, and I'm actually looking into that now together with colleagues, for example, Michael Barham, Melina Porto, but also Terry Osborne and Timothy Reagan. We are looking into those issues. So some intersections between intercultural citizenship and social justice education, and on the left-hand side here, you see Obi-Wan in action, because since you hear him bark, you need to see him at least once. But both are asset pedagogies. We don't look at in a deficit approach, right? So often when we look at English in this context, right? Our students are emergent bilinguals, sometimes are seen, or too often, way too often, are seen from a deficit approach, rather than seeing the assets they have and what they bring to the table and sustaining their identities. So I'm engaged in some of those projects as well with emergent bilinguals. Culturally and linguistically sustaining, moving just beyond just language teaching. They both induce criticality if done well. And we need to focus on that. That's really important. And they both lead to action, right? So those are some commonalities. So we really talk about including students in decisions about their focus of learning. We don't just go in and say, here's what you learn. And you know, if I had more time, this would be more of a conversation as well. I hope we can engage in more conversations in the course of the conference. There will be a session today as well, in which we really can have a conversation, but really including everyone in the decisions of what we learn. I always learn so much more from my students, I feel, than the other way around, unfortunately. Learning activities can also lead with, or in this case, should lead to engagement with people from outside the classroom, and in such a form that they participate in some way in community life, right? By drawing from the competencies that they learn within the classroom. So breaking down those classroom walls. And this is from work I'm doing with Terry Osborne, where we interview educators who have been trailblazers in this area, who have been teaching with social justice approaches, with intercultural citizenship approaches, critical approaches, peace education, human rights education. What all of them say is it's not a method really, but it's a stance of the teacher towards certain social realities. And that came, I think, very much out also in the introductory presentation. It really moves from passive to active, to change agents, right, in teachers and students. The teachers have to reflect deeply on their own perceptions, values, and beliefs, and the underlying assumptions that we have. And it's humbling again and again and again. When we do that, it's not easy, it's not always comfortable. And both students and teachers engage in critical reflections about themselves and their roles in the world, right? And that investigation, that negotiation of who we are, who we want to be, what we do, and how it affects us and the world is really crucial in this endeavor. I'm showing you a few more places, and there are more, and I'm happy to share more references as well, where you can find units, because that, right? So how can this be translated into a classroom practice? Michael Barham, Fabiana Cardetti, and myself published this book, and it was based really on the book Words and Actions. We really liked that format where the theory was introduced and then really practical examples. We tried to do the same. It's still quite complex, but what we did is we created interdisciplinary units at different levels, middle school, high school, higher education, and also different levels of so novice, intermediate, and advanced. Did an interdisciplinary match with the social studies standards, the science standards, the math standards, and we used those to show maybe ones that are not intuitive for everyone to link them with, but you can really link them wonderfully. So again, this looking outside of our classrooms, and the students bring in their knowledge from other disciplines and take it out into the world again, was really important. The topics here are water crisis, Hurricane Maria, immigration, and the Refugee Peace Project. Then I'm going to share some. I'm not going to talk for very long anymore because I do want to have time for interaction, but I'm going to share some examples of applications to really show you that this is, for me in my life, important everywhere in everything I do. So finally, after many years, and you know, you can see that this is quite complex also for me, because as the director of the German Language and Culture program, it took me quite a while to introduce intercultural citizenship as a project into every course that we do in the language program. And now we are doing it. Last year I worked together with Juntao Li. He's a graduate student in the summer, and we really planned ways in which our graduate students who are teaching German 1 through 4 can integrate intercultural citizenship in a way that they choose. So they can also choose the topic, but we also prepared things, you know, graduate student life, you want flexibility, but you also need something that you don't need to make everything from scratch. So that's how we designed it. With Anke Finger, a colleague, and Isabel Sluka, graduate student as well at the University of Connecticut, we started with a small grant from our university, from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, a project decolonizing area studies. And decolonizing, we didn't choose it lightly. We chose it in a way where we are trying together with students, undergraduate students, graduate students, experts from the field, to learn more about this and see what we can do to break down those structures, those barriers that really are still there in German studies, area studies, very much so. And we had different phases. We invited experts. We had panels. We had a symposium. And this year, actually, we have at the end of the semester, we are doing an undergraduate conference that is planned by graduate students and undergraduate students. The undergraduate students in the German program are displaying their intercultural citizenship projects. There are also undergraduate students in Colombia involved. And so there's going to be a conversation, a critical conversation about what are we doing here? What are the issues that we have? How can we address them? We really try to look inside as well. Again, this is not always comfortable, but truly important, I think. Another example is in experiential global learning at the whole university. At my university, we actually are using the reference framework for competencies of democratic culture that is going to be introduced by Dr. Golubeva tomorrow, through which we plan our students' experiences within intercultural contexts in the United States, but also abroad. And there are also assessments that we are planning. We just passed at my university a new general education framework that's pending on 2 more decisions, of course. One of them has to do with the budget. But for now, we adopted a framework, and I co-led an initiative with a colleague, and it's called Common Curriculum for Leadership and Global Citizenship. And finally, there are other projects, one with Melina Porto and Petra Rauschert, in which we looked at intercultural citizenship and injustice and hope in higher education. It was a project with graduate students in Germany, Argentina, and the USA. Some examples of research projects are with Michael Byram. I'm really looking also into the connection between intercultural citizenship and intellectual humility. And Fabiana Cadetti was engaged in this as well. And also conviction. So I explained before that intellectual humility is really what do we know, what do we not know, really owning one's limitations of one's own knowledge. A lot of it has to do with also with collaboration, giving credit when somebody else knows something, knowing where I can find the knowledge that I don't have, for example. And conviction, we looked into it in terms of blind convictions, because convictions do not necessarily need to be proven. So I don't have to have an argument that I'm right for my conviction. I just believe I'm right. It can be a blind conviction. And those, of course, can be dangerous because convictions are linked to our identity and they often lead to action. With Benjamin Rifkin, I look at the role of compassion and empathy in intercultural competence, right? What role does that play? How can we foster specifically compassion in our students? With Terry Osborne, I mentioned the project Trailblazers in Social Justice and Intercultural Citizenship Education. With Jose Aldemar Alvarez, we looked at intellectual and cultural humility. We also looked in the context. He has a project with indigenous populations in Colombia, and I've learned so much from him in this context, where he's working with groups and finding out more in terms of cultural humility as well. And we also look into nonverbal aspects of intercultural competence. With Cassandra Glynn and Dori Perugini, we're looking at intersections of social justice education, intercultural citizenship education, create units that we really want to implement in practice, and then think about how this plays out. How can we really, with Dori, for example, also, how can we sustain our students' cultural identities, their linguistic identities? And finally, with Donna and Salah, Donna Clementi and Salah Yari, we look at how can we work with a large group of educators of Arabic and integrate intercultural citizenship education in a longitudinal collaboration, which is just really wonderful, again, from which I learned so much. The final one I mentioned before is with Elizabeth Howard, a colleague in bilingual education and dual language education at UConn. And we are, with a bigger team, we are trying to create a measure of sociocultural competence. Sociocultural competence is the third goal, it's called, in dual language programs, but it's really not well defined. And we feel it's such an important goal for students to develop the sociocultural competence, their identities again, in order to succeed also in school, and then also to sustain them in many ways. So I'm almost done. I'm leaving you with a few questions and hope that we can have a conversation. I have some backup slides if you don't have questions, but my questions for you are really, do you think it's important for students to make connections between what they learn in school and the world around them? It's not a leading question. There are concerns that we can have, so I'm happy to talk about both. How can we try to make sure that students really feel free to decide what they think? And this could be a whole seminar, I think. This is really, truly important. What are some implications of this way of teaching for students, teachers, and society, right? those are some questions that I would like to leave you with. And I also, of course, I'm very happy to take your questions. And if you like, we can actually, I don't know if we can see each other if the slides are down, Olumide, but I'd be happy to see everyone if we take the slides down. And maybe we can copy those questions into the chat. I don't know how that would work. And I can remind you of the questions as well. Should I stop share now, or how does this work?
Oh, you might still keep the slides so that anyone who wants to respond.
Oh, so there's no way of seeing each other.
You will not be able to see
Okay.
the audience from the stage right now, except the entire set. So,
okay.
But
so yeah, I'd love to engage with you. I try to very hard keep it to 45 minutes so that we can really also talk with each other already now and then continue later on in the afternoon.
Yeah, I'm sure the questions and comments will come in, and thank you for that insightful presentation. I have a question. Maybe I can start from my hand. I want to know how intercultural citizenship education describes the connections between sociocultural competence and identity. I know you made mention of that, and especially about the project that you're doing that is related to that. But I want to know what your thoughts about that is.
So, so we are actually in this question probably would have been easier for me to answer before we engaged in this project that we've been in for a year and a half now. So I can tell you what we are doing to sort of get to this, to get to the bottom of this. We actually read literature. In our case, we want to do it in dual language education, right? So we read literature about how is sociocultural competence defined within dual language education. And there's not all that much. There are some papers by actually my co-investigator and some colleagues. And they're really interesting papers by Freire, a colleague whose name is also Freire, fittingly in some way, but it's not Paolo Freire, on critical social awareness within emergent bilingualism and dual language programs. So we collected that literature. We collected literature that describes intercultural competence from a variety of sources. We looked at literature of ratio-linguistics. We looked at literature of anti-racism. So we had different bodies of literature that we looked at. And from those, we tried to pull the main concepts. And we are now actually mapping the concepts that we find onto the reference framework for competencies of democratic culture that is going to be introduced tomorrow. Because the reference framework for competencies of democratic culture has actually developed descriptors, validated descriptors for different ages. And we are now integrating the context, the questions that are important for us. So how is the context here? The reference framework was created for the European context. And we took the literature from here, especially for emergent bilingualism, and are mapping it on and trying to change or modify the descriptors so that they really fit within our context. We also are using the social justice standards. They used to be the Learning for Tolerance standards. They're now called social justice standards. And we are creating scenarios in which students then can respond to scenarios and in which we find out how to their descriptors map. You asked about identity. Next week, I might have the final version of our identity descriptors. I don't want to, we haven't compared them yet. So I have mine, my group has theirs, and we are going to compare them actually next week, how identity plays out. it has been a really interesting process and humbling process, because on the one hand, there's so much material out there that's really, really helpful. On the other hand, it's really easy to feel like you don't get all the complexity in, especially in a measure that you want to give to third grade students.
All right, thank you.
Yes. Oh, thank you. So this question, I'm always grappling with the tension between the first two questions, the importance of students to think beyond the classroom and into the world, and ensuring their right to free thought. How might we remedy this tension? Maybe this tension feeds into question 3. Yes. Yeah. So I wish I had answers for you. I have some examples of what we try to do and some what colleagues did. Colleagues are doing just wonderful things out there. So I think if we focus on the skills always, and if we foster those conversations, those critical conversations in the classroom, we have a chance of helping students think freely, right? The whole issue, of course, is we grade students. So students might really often think, what does my teacher want to hear? What does my teacher want me to think? So, for example, and I give this example because for me it was eye-opening at the very beginning of my teaching career in higher education. I also taught at K through 12. But in a college context, in German, we always talk about those issues, and I've always engaged my students in talking about current issues. And one student came to me, thankfully, very much at the beginning of the class, because she knew me from before, from outside this specific classroom, but from Kaffeestunden, coffee hours that we had, and so on. She said, Professor Wagner, I want to tell you, I dress like a hippie, but I do not think like one. I'm actually quite conservative, and I've experienced at the university sometimes that my colleagues assume that I think a certain way, and then I feel embarrassed when they notice I don't think a certain way. So she shared some thoughts with me, and she said, and especially in classrooms where we talk a lot and give our opinion, that is really hard for me. And I was so grateful that she shared that with me. And I shared with her, listen, we are going to talk about these topics, but you do not need to tell your own opinion. In fact, I will try to introduce topics where we investigate different perspectives, and you might well investigate a perspective that you don't have, right? And if you don't comfortable sharing, we might have a debate again where you don't need to say what you personally think, but you analyze a situation, and from the different perspectives, then you say something. And maybe, if you're comfortable, then you share what you feel and what you think. And so I constantly think about this. How do I situate my learners so that they're comfortable thinking about these issues in the classroom in really critical ways? And that's not easy, and it doesn't always work. The only time when I intervene with this is when discriminatory, hurtful things come up, which they really don't often, but they could. Or when human rights violations come up. So there we need to be careful, I think. This was not an answer, and as a solution necessarily. Yes, I actually need to find it for you, because I'm a very nice colleague and I'm blanking on the first name. But I will share this with Olumide, if I may, so that he can share this with you. And I can share more papers actually that we found that were really fascinating in this area, and I'm happy to discuss more about that later as well. Can everybody see the questions that come up? Yes, I think so,
yes,
right?
They can, yes. Yes, so those are the 3 questions we have right now.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I'm happy to actually share an example of how this can be adjusted with elementary language skills. Would that be helpful?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I might even have an example here, and that again is something that a grad student did. Students are absolutely wonderful. So, he was actually in a graduate course and thought about intercultural citizenship, intercultural competence. And he teaches Polish and had a Polish textbook. There are not too many Polish textbooks available. The Polish textbook that he has, when he looked at it, he said, there are so many things in this textbook that I don't really agree with, right? And this is an elementary textbook. So how can I adapt these activities? What can I do with them to counteract stereotypes, for example, as just one example? So here's an activity on the right-hand side. You see, this is from Robert Satrip, and the activity is, Mommy is from Japan. She speaks Japanese. Uwe is from Germany. He speaks German, and so on. So, this one-on-one country language identification just for quote unquote, just for language learning. So he said, that really isn't enough. That doesn't help any skills, develop any intercultural skills. On the contrary, it might actually counteract them. So he developed an activity where he said to the students, choose 3 of the characters from the list and then conduct an internet search on the languages and in the different contexts in the countries. What is the official language, minority language, most popular foreign language? They have the vocabulary to do that even, right? And then they can make a little table. Then they ask each other questions. And again, they have the linguistic skills even fairly early on to do that. Then they discuss the information that surprised them most and that they found most interesting. Then they write down, they evaluate the most interesting piece of information. And at home, they can conduct more research. They can do some of that in Polish, but also in other languages, in their home languages, and really find out more information. And so what did this activity do? What did this activity do? How did it change the original activity to the activity? What do the students learn in the original activity, and what do they learn in this activity? What did Robert manage to change? Question for the audience.
We have about 3 minutes, so I hope we can take that.
Yeah. So in the first activity, there was really, this country speaks that language, right? All people in this country speak that language. What notions does this activity maybe foster? What notions does this activity, what do the students learn? What do they take away from this other than Japanese? What else do they learn? Yes. What are the dominant and what are the marginal groups of languages in different contexts? Absolutely. Right. And what I always find fascinating, when we do that about other contexts, sometimes we can go back and really be more critical about our own as well, right? So there are diversity. Maria, thank you very much. Absolutely. They learn about diversity, that it's not a one-to-one relationship between language and culture, right? And they use their language to really investigate something, to interpret information related to their own. They discover and interact, right? So they do the things in the model. Patterns of migration, fantastic. Yeah, they can find really interesting information. And the homework, when they can also do it in their own languages, it sustains their linguistic identities as well. You don't always need to do something in the dominant language that you learn in another part of the world also that can actually be your oppressor's language, right? So there are those really complex relationships as well, so the identity parts of this. Okay, so I leave it at that. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry I could not see you, but I wanted to, here, there is a slide in which I say, No, thank you. Thank you very much. On Twitter, you can find me at Manuela Wag. Twitter is my professional development. I love following colleagues on Twitter. So these are just really fascinating opportunities to engage with each other. And there are often critical questions and critical conversations happening on Twitter. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing. Yes, consider too inviting students. Yes, about paintings and wonderful pictures and paintings. Thank you so much. I look forward to hopefully seeing you around at the conference.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Wagner, for that insightful presentation. And so Dr. Wagner and Dr. Gulbeva, the two keynote speakers, will be having a graduate student mentorship session by 3:30 p.m. today, EST. So make sure you join that session. If you have all the questions, I know we can't take all of those questions right now, but we will be able to take that then. And they will also be able to see our faces then. So we'll work on all of this. Thank you all. And the next session starts at 10:30. So speakers, you are able to go into your rooms once your session starts, and you're able to share your screens. And attendees are also able to contribute. They are able to chat, and they are able to see the speaker. So if you have any technical issues, please make sure you reach out to me. Thank you so much.